Mark Bennett never thought leaving his small Oklahoma hometown would lead him to the most unexpected turn of his life. With only a few dollars in his pocket and a heart full of ambition, he heads to New York, ready to carve out his own path. Hard work and determination soon make him one of the city's most sought-after handymen, but fate has other plans. One urgent call, a flooded bathroom, and a desperate woman change everything. When he's offered an unusual deal, $10,000 to play the role of a runaway groom, Mark finds himself standing at the altar of a woman he's never met. What starts as a charade soon feels more real than either of them expected. As the night unfolds, stolen glances and unspoken words blur the lines between pretense and reality. But can love truly grow from a single evening of make-believe? Or will dawn bring nothing but a return to the lives they once knew? Step into a whirlwind romance where one bold decision turns a simple handyman into the leading man of a story he never saw coming. The warm scent of homemade pie and sizzling meat filled the small kitchen, wrapping it in a cozy atmosphere where nostalgia, warmth, and a faint trace of sorrow mingled together. Around the wooden table draped with a checkered tablecloth, the Bennett family gathered for a farewell dinner. Mark Bennett, a 25-year-old man with strong hands and a steady gaze, lowered his head, tracing the cracks on the table's worn surface. This table had seen it all. Morning breakfasts before school, Sunday dinners after church, long talks with his dad about work and life. It was all here, in this small Oklahoma town he had called home since birth. But tomorrow, he was leaving. "Are you sure?" His mother's voice trembled, though she tried to keep it steady. "Yeah, Mom." He looked up and gave her a faint smile. "I have to give it a shot." His father, a strong man with calloused hands, remained silent, slowly cutting into his steak. He had never been a man of many words, but his approval or disappointment was always clear in his eyes. Tonight, Mark saw both. New York is a whole different world, his younger sister Julie mumbled, poking at her mashed potatoes with her fork. "Crowds, traffic, crime, and opportunities, Julie," Mark cut in. "Opportunities we don't have here." He had grown up in a family of carpenters. His father and grandfather were skilled craftsmen, but the jobs were getting scarcer, the pay shrinking year by year. He could have stayed, fixing roofs and building fences, but something inside him wanted more. Mark didn't just want to build houses, he wanted to build a life. His mother wiped away a tear. His father raised his glass of iced tea. "Then here's to your journey, son," he said. "Don't forget who you are and where you come from." Early the next morning, as the sky blushed with soft pink hues, Mark loaded the last suitcase into his truck. The old but reliable Ford F-150 stood by the curb, ready for the long road ahead. Julie, wrapped in a hoodie, hugged him tight, pressing her face against his shoulder. "You'll call?" "Of course." He ruffled her hair. "And you better call me too." His mother stood on the porch, hands clasped together as if in prayer. His father, as always, remained silent. He stepped forward, pulled a folded envelope from his pocket, and handed it to Mark. "For your start," he said simply. A lump formed in Mark's throat. He knew his father wouldn't have given him money if he didn't believe in him. "Thanks, Dad," he murmured, shaking his father's hand firmly. He slid into the driver's seat, turned the key in the ignition. One last glance at the house, at the family that had been his whole world. Then, he pressed down on the gas. The dusty road stretched out ahead of him, and with it, his new life began. Mark drove into New York City exhausted but wide-eyed with excitement. Towering glass skyscrapers, endless crowds, and the constant hum of the streets. It was overwhelming, yet electrifying. He felt like a tiny drop in an endless ocean, but he knew this was his shot. Luck was on his side. On his very first day, he landed a job at a property management company that needed reliable hands. His new boss, a silver-haired man named Henry Cross, saw potential in him right away. "Hope you're not afraid of hard work," Henry said, narrowing his eyes. "No, sir. I need this job, and I'll give it everything I've got," Mark replied with confidence. And so his new life began. From dawn till dusk, he fixed plumbing, wiring, doors, replaced windows, and patched up roofs. Sometimes he even worked through the night if there was an emergency. He quickly learned that this city never slept, and neither could he. His first home was a tiny apartment on the third floor of an old Brooklyn building. Low ceilings, creaky floors, and the constant noise from the street. It wasn't much, but it was his. For months he slept on a mattress on the floor, but little by little he made it feel like home. He picked up a used couch, a small kitchen table, and even found a second-hand TV someone had left out on the curb. Years passed, and Mark became one of the most in-demand handymen in the area. His phone never stopped ringing, and landlords and homeowners passed his number around like gold. "Mark, I need an urgent bathroom repair. When can you come?" called Mrs. Hall, an elderly woman whose place always seemed to be falling apart. "I'll be there first thing in the morning, Mrs. Hall," he'd reply with a smile. He had built the life he had dreamed of. He bought a small but cozy apartment of his own, picked up a used but well-kept Ford Explorer, perfect for work. Sometimes, when he looked in the mirror, he saw traces of his father, his steady gaze, the same firm grip in his hands. But one thing still gnawed at him. He was alone. Life in the big city had brought success, but it had also carved out a deep loneliness inside him. He worked, he earned, but every time he came home, there was no one waiting for him. Then, one evening, after finishing up another job and packing up his tools, there was a knock at the door. "Excuse me, are you Mark Bennett?" A woman's voice asked. Mark turned around. Standing before him was a young woman with deep brown eyes and a slightly tousled look to her hair. "Yeah, that's me. How can I help you?" He didn't know it yet, but this was the day his life would change forever. One Sunday morning, Mark's phone rang. He picked up, expecting another urgent job. He got those a lot, but the voice on the other end was shaky, almost panicked. "Please, you have to come. The faucet, it broke off and there's water everywhere. I don't know what to do." The woman was barely holding back tears. Mark was used to emergency calls, but there was something in her voice that made him move faster. Grabbing his toolbox and throwing on a jacket, he rushed out of his apartment. Brooklyn was waking up. People were walking their dogs, grabbing morning coffee from the corner bakery. But he had no time for the usual city rhythm. 20 minutes later, he stood in front of a solid brick townhouse, the kind you'd find in New York's older neighborhoods. The door swung open almost immediately. A well-dressed woman in her 50s stood there, her brown eyes red from crying. "I'm so sorry. I just didn't know what else to do," she mumbled, stepping aside to let him in. Mark nodded and headed straight to the bathroom. It was a mess. A broken faucet was spraying water everywhere, steam rising from the hot flow. The floor was covered in a thin layer of water, inching its way toward the hallway. He shut off the main valve, stopping the flood, then turned back to the woman. "It's under control now. I'll replace the faucet. Nothing to worry about," he said calmly. She nodded slowly, but her hands were still trembling. Mark noticed. This wasn't just about a plumbing issue. "Are you okay?" he asked as he knelt to assess the damage. She clenched her fingers into a fist, tight, as if trying to steady herself. "This is my husband's house," she said quietly. "Ex-husband's. He left a few months ago and left me with all of this. I'm trying to keep up, but sometimes things just fall apart." Mark kept working, but he saw this job differently now. This wasn't just about fixing pipes. It was someone trying to put their life back together. "I can do more than fix a faucet," he said without looking up. "If you need help around the house." The woman hesitated, then gave a small nod. "That would be nice. I'm Elizabeth, by the way." "Mark," he replied with a smile. That day marked the beginning of something new, for both of them. When Mark stepped out of the bathroom, drenched from head to toe, Elizabeth was already waiting for him in the doorway. Her arms were crossed, her expression a mix of anxiety and determination. "I know this is going to sound strange, but I need a favor," she said quickly, like she was afraid she might lose her nerve. "I'll pay you $10,000 if you agree to pretend to be my daughter's fiancé for the day." Mark froze. "I'm sorry, what?" Elizabeth exhaled and wiped her damp palms on her expensive linen skirt. "The real fiancé backed out. This morning. The wedding is already paid for. The guests are there. The venue is waiting. If we cancel, it'll be a disaster, for my daughter, and for our entire family." Mark felt the weight of the situation pressing on him. Even though he'd only just met Elizabeth, he hesitated. $10,000 was a lot of money, but that wasn't what worried him the most. "Can I at least meet the bride first?" he asked after a long pause. Elizabeth nodded and disappeared up the stairs. A moment later, a young woman entered the room. Her dark hair was neatly styled, though a few strands had fallen loose. Her face was blotchy, her eyes swollen from crying. She barely looked up. "Claire, sweetheart, this is Mark. He's willing to help, but only if you're okay with it too," Elizabeth said gently, resting a comforting hand on her daughter's shoulder. Claire finally lifted her gaze. There was exhaustion and heartbreak in her eyes. She nodded, as if she'd already given up caring. Mark looked at her and felt something strange. Not pity, but something deeper. He knew what it was like to be let down, to feel lost. He took a deep breath. "All right," he said, "but just for one day." A few hours later, Mark stood at the entrance of the upscale restaurant. The tuxedo he'd thrown on fit him perfectly, even though it had been chosen in a rush. A silver pin gleamed on the lapel, and in his hands he held a bouquet of fresh, white roses. It all felt so foreign to him. He was used to work jeans, dusty boots, and the smell of wood, not silk ties and expensive perfume. A limousine smoothly pulled up to the restaurant, and the driver quickly opened the door. Claire stepped out of the car. For a moment, Mark forgot that this was all just a show. In front of him stood not the tearful girl he'd seen in the morning, but a stunning woman in a dazzling white dress. It cascaded in light waves, emphasizing her fragility, but there was no trace of the weakness that had been in her eyes earlier. Their eyes met, and Claire froze for a second. "You look." Mark trailed off, not knowing how to find the right words. "You do too," she whispered, then, swallowing hard, added, "Are you ready?" He nodded and extended his hand to her. Inside the restaurant, the sounds of live music filled the air, and the scent of flowers and fine wines lingered. Guests were seated at tables adorned with crystal and silver, laughing and congratulating the newlyweds. Everything seemed perfect, if you didn't know the truth. At first, Mark felt out of place. He could see the guests looking at him, sizing him up, curious. Some whispered about him, others observed the groom with interest. But the moment he looked at Claire, everything around him lost its meaning. They danced, holding on a little tighter than was necessary for the act. Their gazes lingered just a second longer. With each passing moment, their performance became less and less fake. During the toast, Mark found himself thinking that he didn't want the evening to end. Claire laughed, looking at him, her eyes sparkling not from tears, but from genuine happiness. Her smile no longer carried the pain he'd seen that morning. He realized that they had both forgotten that this was all just a show. As the evening drew to a close, Elizabeth approached Mark with an envelope in her hand. "This is your money," she said. "You've fulfilled your part of the deal." Mark looked at her, then turned his gaze to Claire. She was standing off to the side, her head lowered as if waiting for something. He took the envelope and handed it back. "No," he said firmly, "I can't take this." Elizabeth frowned, surprised, but said nothing. A heavy silence hung in the air, tense like an unfinished conversation. Suddenly Claire stepped forward. "Mark," she said quietly. He turned to her, and in that moment, something changed. He saw something in her eyes that couldn't be faked. Something real, something that didn't end with the evening. "Stay," she said almost in a whisper, "just for a little while." Mark froze. Just a few hours ago, he had been an ordinary carpenter, and now here he was, standing before a woman who could change his life. He nodded. "All right," he said. "I'll stay." A year had passed since that life-changing night. Mark didn't feel out of place in this new, wealthy world, but he didn't let it change who he was, either. New York had taught him a lot: patience, perseverance, and how to spot opportunities where others saw obstacles. But the most important lesson had been meeting Claire, the woman he found at the most unexpected moment of his life. Sitting on the terrace of their new home in Westchester, Mark watched the last rays of sunlight paint the sky in shades of lavender and rose gold. The house, surrounded by a well-kept garden, was far bigger than the tiny apartment he'd started with when he first came to New York. But even here, among the expensive furniture and refined decor, Mark had kept the simplicity and grounded nature of someone who was used to working with his hands. Down below, on the lawn, Claire was talking to the landscape designer, discussing the plan for a new gazebo. Her voice was confident, but when she looked up and noticed him, her eyes lit up with that warm glow Mark loved so much. He slowly made his way down to her, savoring the moment. "What do you think?" Claire asked, pointing at the blueprints. Do you think it'd be good to put a bench here? Mark didn't look at the blueprints. Instead, he took her hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. Wherever you decide to put it, it'll be the perfect spot. She smiled, tucking her hair behind her ear, and the designer tactfully stepped aside, giving them a moment of privacy. Claire looked at her husband, and in her eyes there was something more than just love. Gratitude, trust, calm. The past year had brought huge changes to their lives, but they had walked that path together. I never thought a broken faucet would lead me to the love of my life, he said with a small chuckle. Claire shook her head, smiling. I never thought a meltdown before my wedding would lead me to a man who would never leave me. She leaned in closer, and their lips met in a light but deep kiss. Mark ran his hand along her back, feeling her warmth. It seemed like this moment could last forever. But life wasn't just made up of beautiful sunsets and romantic confessions. They both knew how much work and compromise their relationship had taken. The past year had been challenging. At first, Claire had struggled with the gossip. Friends and acquaintances didn't believe their fake marriage had turned into something real. But when they saw the way Mark looked at her, how he cared for her, the doubts faded. He'd been there for her when she had to rebuild trust after her ex-fiancé's betrayal, and he had supported her when her business faced struggles. In turn, Claire had helped him believe he deserved more than just a job working with his hands. Thanks to her, he'd opened his own repair and plumbing company. Now, not only did he have his own workshop, but he also ran a small shop that had become popular with the locals. His clients loved him not just for his professionalism, but for his honesty. Mark doesn't just fix pipes, he fixes lives, they joked. Suddenly, Claire sighed and leaned against him. What are you thinking about? He asked, covering her hand with his. About how quickly everything changed. A year ago, I was crying in my room thinking my life was ruined, and now I'm here, with you. Sometimes it feels like a dream. If this is a dream, he replied, then I don't ever want to wake up. She smiled, but then her expression turned serious. She took a deep breath, as if gathering her courage. Mark, there's something I need to tell you. He looked at her, waiting for her to continue. I'm pregnant. Time seemed to freeze. The words hung in the air, and for the first few seconds, Mark just stared at her, processing what he had heard. Then his face lit up with a smile, genuine, warm, the kind Claire had never seen before. Really? His voice was full of excitement. She nodded, and before she could say anything more, Mark swept her up into his arms and twirled her around, laughing. This was happiness, pure, unquestionable, and real. He set her back on the ground, still holding her by the waist, and looked into her eyes. I can't even begin to tell you how happy I am. Claire wiped away a tear of joy. You know, when I was little, my mom used to say that family isn't about the people you're born with. It's about those who choose to be by your side, no matter what. You've become that family for me, Mark. And now our family is about to grow. He gently kissed her forehead, feeling warmth spread inside him. We'll make it work, he said confidently. The night wrapped them in its soft embrace, and in the distance, the sound of neighborhood kids laughing as they set off fireworks drifted through the air. Mark and Claire stood, hand in hand, knowing that a new chapter of their lives was ahead of them. A chapter full of love, challenges, and hope.